If you can read that, then I guess we'll just get started. All right, so this is week 2. So last week we covered basically an introduction, and we looked at how the Bible itself and all the commandments in it, the entire Old Testament, was meant to be a teacher for us. So this week we're going to move on to another form of moral theory to see if we can find something that really fits a biblical principle of morality. So just kind of as a review, some broad moral frameworks that kind of encompass almost every framework out there is relativism. So there is no absolute truth. We talked about this last week. There's no absolute truth, but everyone must do what they believe is morally right. And eventually, after many, many iterations, we will get to a point where we reach something that is usable enough to be called true morality. Then this week we're going to talk about consequentialism, which is the ends of every action determines the moral value. So the ends justify the means. If something has a good product, it must have been a good process, is the idea. And then today we're also going to cover divine command theory, which is the word of God determines what is good and evil, which obviously sounds better. So just to kind of review this, moral relativism from last week was there's nothing fixed that is true. There's nothing truly moral that we can look to and say, aha, this is how we should behave. Everything has to kind of develop itself. So this kind of comes out of the idea of biological evolution, since there is no fixed creator, since there is no moral absolute, there's no physical absolute. Morality itself, good and evil, must also be something that develops over time. So we start with nothing at all, and after many, many, many millions or thousands of years of developing our theories and our behaviors, we will reach something that is good enough to work for us. And eventually everyone will bring themselves into that one moral theory, and we will have a useful system going forward. And so we kind of looked through that. We saw there was some benefits to it, honestly not a lot of benefits, but at least it's cultural enforcement I found was the most beneficial part of this theory, where if you do something wrong, your culture has to correct you. So there is something good, there is something redeemable about this theory, but not much. The problems with it were many and tremendous. So anything at all is excusable. So if there's no fixed moral value, then you can do anything you want. And it's perfectly fine as long as your group says it is. And even if sometime later we find out that's not quite right, that's okay in the moment. We have to refine our moral theories going forward. So that's just kind of a review of moral relativism. We saw that it's clearly not biblical from Isaiah 5:20, which tells you that woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. So the Bible acknowledges that there are fixed absolutes, not just in morality, but in the physical world. And the parallel there should instruct us in morality. So if you see there's clearly bitter food and sweet food, those are not the same. That's true with morality. There is good and there is evil. They are not the same, and you can know the difference. So today we're going to go over utilitarianism and then divine command theory. So utilitarianism, big word, fancy word, don't worry about it. When you see utilitarianism, think utility, the first half of that word. It's a theory that is based on what is useful. What is most useful and productive to society is good. So this theory is the main form of consequentialism. And so when you hear consequentialism, another big word. So what does that mean? Consequentialism is a branch of morality that is focused on the consequences of your action. It's built into the word right there. So should be a little helpful. So the ultimate morality of a situation is determined by its outcome. The best good is that which maximizes the happiness of the most people. So basic definition is do that which maximizes the happiness of the most people, if you can read that. If you can't read that, I can give you handouts. You have to ask for them, though. So the basis of this argument goes something like this. All people experience pain and pleasure to some extent, which leads to happiness and unhappiness. It is objectively true and universally agreed upon that happiness is better than unhappiness, right? So far, so good. It's better to be happy than unhappy. Therefore, whatever leads to the increase in happiness and the reduction of unhappiness must be universally and objectively true. So it's basically just a brute force, make people happy. And not just make people happy, but make the most people happy and make them as happy as possible. So anything that promotes that is considered morally good. Now there's lots of nuance. This is a very broad way to look at it, but there's a lot of nuance and different variations of this theory that say, well, it's not just happiness, it's happiness plus prosperity or whatever you want to add on to it. Those add-ons are somewhat arbitrary also, but at the core of it, this is the argument that do that which maximizes the happiness of the most people. So that's kind of good. So benefits, what do we get from that? It's extremely persuasive. So this is probably the biggest benefit and the most important thing to understand about utilitarianism. It's extremely persuasive. There's almost nobody anywhere on earth that can disagree with the general principle of increasing universal happiness. I think we would all agree being happy is better than being unhappy. It's a good thing to promote happiness in the most people. That is just good. So even if a rule is completely random, if it gives good outcome, people will naturally agree with the rule. So for example, if we say you must only shake hands with your right hand, there's nothing fixed about that. There's no reason you can't use your left hand. But if we're all agreeing on one rule, then it promotes good things. Everyone now, when you shake hands, you don't do this kind of like, oh, what's going on thing. You just shake hands. So it's a good rule. It has a good result, therefore it's a good rule. Regardless of what the rule itself is, if it has a good result, it's good. Almost all arguments about any law is naturally going to be based on the merits of that law, whether moral or political law. So this is simply because we can all agree that outcomes that are beneficial to us are better than outcomes that are detrimental to us. And we fall into this situation a lot. When we argue pretty much anything to anyone else in the whole world, you're going to say, let's lower taxes because X, and X will be a result of lowering taxes. And you'll argue that that's a good thing, therefore lowering the taxes is a good thing. You can show objectively how one moral action is better than another by measuring its outcomes. So, which is another very important thing. If you can say, oh, we did this, which had this measurable, definitive, real outcome, that's good. And that's great for this theory because it makes it very easy. You can just say, back in the past, they did this thing, it had this good result, now we must do that. Since it had a good result, it's a good rule. Another good benefit is that all discussions of morality have a common starting point, which is happiness is good and sadness is bad. And this is helpful because in our extremely polarized world, it's rare that there's common ground between very disparate people. So if you as a Christian talk to an atheist, you don't have much in common. And especially when talking about morality, you have almost nothing to base your common arguments on. But in this moral framework, you do. You can simply say one is measurably better than another. This is very good. It's very good for a moral system to have that, and it's very, very useful, which is the design of this theory. It's useful in practical life, and it's also flexible. What I mean by flexible is it can grow to fit more situations. So it's useful. Good rules have good outcomes. That's genuinely, by definition, useful. But also, moral rules can be measured, ranked, and argued about objectively. And this is the real benefit of this situation. There is no subjective anything involved with this. If it's good for you, it's good for everyone. If it produces a good result, it is by definition good. Doesn't matter how you feel about that rule. This is really important since it allows, and it's also flexible. There's no fixed set of rules that it must follow, except that it must promote happiness. So this is very good, in fact. It may seem a little vague, but it's good because it allows you to grow. If you're presented with a new situation, some new thing happens, aliens invade Earth, now you have a moral framework to deal with the aliens in some way. I don't know. But it's not fixed and rigid like some other systems are. And it gives you this flexibility to do more things, find out how those results are, and then redo what your morality is until you get good results no matter where you are or what you're doing. So that is a benefit to the theory. It's also morally instructive since good results come from good rules and vice versa. If your morality produces a bad result, that instructs you. Now you have a bad morality and you must change it. So it's good. And that fits that biblical requirement that The law from the Bible is morally instructive to us. So is this. So that's good. Maybe we're hitting the right, we're on the right tree. Experimentation with the rules show what things work and why, leading to better results and teaching us things about ourselves. So it teaches us about our human nature also. It's not just the nature of morality. It teaches us that, if you say lower taxes means people work harder because they get to keep more of their money, okay, that teaches you about human nature, that kind of thing. So it is a very useful theory in that way. It teaches you more about more than just what morality is, what's good or evil. If there's some nebulous good or evil that we're working towards, it tells you more than simply that it exists or what it is. It tells you how people respond to it also. So that is a good thing. So for example, laws against theft promote commerce and safety. And therefore those laws are good because commerce and safety promote happiness and prosperity. Laws against slavery also promoted economic progress and eventually greater happiness for all. Even though for the slave masters who you simply took away their slaves, it's not good for them in the moment, but in the long term, it is good for everyone, including the slave masters and the slaves. So it's a good outcome. So that's pretty good. It's a decent theory. It's a very popular theory for those reasons. But let's go look at some problems of this theory, and these are pretty bad. The calculation problem. So this is the classic objection to utilitarianism. How are you supposed to know in every circumstance what choice will lead to the best outcome? This is a fundamental problem that no one in this theory really has a good answer to, and it has universally defeated this argument pretty much everywhere it's found. But people try to get around this by having spin-off theories, which try to answer this by saying they're going to add certain criteria that it's maximizing. It's not just happiness, which is somewhat nebulous. It's economic prosperity. Okay, that's measurable and definable. We can track that kind of thing. So there's lots of nuance to a lot of these theories, but in general, this calculation problem of you must know the outcome of your action for all time, for every action. You must know it, and you must calculate it before you do it. That's somewhat insurmountable. You can't really know if I wear a green shirt or a blue shirt today, what influence that's going to have on everyone. Maybe someone is deathly allergic to the color blue and you'll just kill them, and you can't know that kind of stuff. Maybe that's a little silly, but if you cook a peanut butter dish for dinner on the grounds and someone has an anaphylactic shock because they didn't know there was peanuts in it, that's bad. So maybe a rule would be no peanuts anywhere on Earth. And you don't know these things. It's hard to calculate these things. In fact, it's impossible to calculate these things. And this is a serious problem with this theory. There's another problem. Nothing is morally neutral. So every choice you make, no matter how small or limited, will have an impact on someone's life in some way. And it will influence their happiness in some way, even if it's the smallest degree, which leads to every action and choice being a moral one. So I grabbed this tie. I just said, oh, whatever, that tie. And I didn't think much about it. But if it causes someone to be unhappy, mostly my wife, if I pick the wrong clothes, then it's just weird. I have to now think about that thing. Now, I do have to think about that anyway, but at least it's not a sin for me to have picked the wrong set of clothing because it doesn't match or whatever. But in this case, in this theory, it would be. Because you are decreasing someone's happiness even a little. Therefore, you must do, no matter what it is, you must do the thing to promote happiness. Nothing is, strictly speaking, neutral. Anything at all is permissible if it increases happiness. So similar to the moral relativism theory, anything at all is permissible if your group allows it. In this case, anything at all is permissible if it results in more happiness to more people. In fact, it's not just permitted, it's required, since not doing the action would reduce overall happiness. So if you have to clap, if clapping when you wake up makes 3 people in your house very happy, but it makes you slightly unhappy, you must do the clap because you are promoting happiness for everyone. And you are required to do it. If you don't do it, they will be sad and that'll be bad. So it comes from the lack of neutrality. If nothing is neutral, then everything is regulated. And everything is regulated, you must follow the code everywhere you go. So this is a really bad situation, in fact, and this leads us to a really bad set of outcomes. So because universal happiness is the goal, universal moral enforcement is also needed. So you have to have a lot of busybodies, in other words. The individual happiness of a single or small group of people is not important if it's outweighed by the total happiness of all people. So it now comes to a numbers game in a lot of ways, which falls into the calculation problem. If it makes one person really, really, really unhappy, but makes two people really, really, really happy, you must do it, since it would maximize happiness. So for an example, this is the kind of example you'll see if you ever take an ethics course or an ethics course, I guess, in some university. If there were 5 people in a hospital who all needed organ transplants, so like someone needed a lung, someone needed a heart, someone needed a spleen, and 2 other ones. Let's see. If someone needed, 5 people needed these organs, and the doctor had no donors, it would be a morally good thing for the doctor to go look outside, find a homeless person, kidnap him, harvest his organs, and fix the 5 people. And why is that? Because you are greatly reducing the happiness of that one poor homeless person, but you're greatly increasing the happiness of the 5 people who are dying of the organ failure. So it's a morally good thing to do that, even though I see a lot of people shaking their heads. That's clearly wrong. But why is it wrong is the real question. We have good instincts, I believe, that show us that that's simply wrong. You don't just go kidnapping hobos because your hospital's donor list is short. But in a utilitarian system, you would, in fact, do that. And you would do a lot of worse things. So this same line of thinking can be applied on a larger scale, and it gets really scary. If a small group of people are a burden to a large group, that small group must be eliminated, or at least their burden must be eliminated. So this is exactly what the left says about people who have religious objections to neopronouns, for example, or whatever the current thing is today. So if one group of people, namely Christians, says, oh, I'm not going to use your weird pronouns because it's silly, they will say, oh, you are greatly reducing the happiness of one or a small group of people who may in fact commit suicide. And this is exactly the argument they use. They say the suicide rate of the trans community is extremely high. Therefore, you must coddle them. Because you'll hear language like this. What does it mean to you? How does it affect you if you just use someone's pronouns? It's no big deal to you, but to them, it's everything. This is a utilitarian argument. You are promoting their happiness greatly by reducing your happiness just a little bit. Just that one little thing of, okay, you're a he when you're really a she. That makes a tiny difference for just the words you're speaking. But to the person you're talking to, the idea is, the theory is, that it increases their happiness. So now you must do it. So these are the arguments. This is how it makes its way into our society. So furthermore, for more examples, if you think objectively, this is where it gets really dark. If you think objectively, with the greatest number of people in mind, you will eventually come to the conclusion that things like eugenics is the highest possible moral good that can be achieved. And why is this? Because the elimination of the genetically sick, mentally retarded, or genetically inferior, keep the quotes for the camera, genetically inferior people and other burdens on society will reduce their happiness. Obviously, it's not good for you to eliminate them, but it will increase the happiness of everyone in the present and future generations forever. So this is the real key. If you simply eliminate a genetic defect in the human population, like here's a defect that just makes you born with one arm, that's not good. If you simply eliminate that genetic defect, forevermore, you will never have these harmful results. That's a good thing. But how do you eliminate that defect is the real problem. So these types of arguments were used in America's early eugenics programs in the late 1800s and early 1900s. You probably don't know much about this, but America had a very strong eugenics program, specifically in California, where they were sterilizing and killing, well, they weren't killing so many as sterilizing a lot of people through, especially black people, in fact. If you look at the history of this, They would encourage black people to come into hospitals to get vaccines or treatments, and they would give them the wrong vaccine on purpose. They would give them medication on purpose to sterilize them. It was pretty barbaric, but this was America in the early 1900s and late 1800s. And this model was studied by the Nazis, and they improved upon it. They thought this was a great idea. Let's take all the retarded people, all the genetically inferior, all the people who are burdening society, and let's just get rid of them. And so that's exactly what they did. The Nazis copied and expanded on this program, and to obviously horrible results. And unfortunately, this thinking is making a comeback. And it's making a comeback not so much in forced sterilizations, but in the form of abortion. So, for example, Iceland has recently almost completely eliminated Down syndrome from the entire nation. That's a good thing. It's a good thing to have no Down syndrome. But it's a bad thing the way they did that. They did that by they gave free Down syndrome screening to the entire population of Iceland and basically pressured them into having abortions if they found the genetic marker that said you have Down syndrome. So I believe there's something like 3 people in Iceland born in the last 10 or 15 years that have Down syndrome. That's it, because everyone else is aborted. So this is pretty monstrous. Now, they also don't have a problem with abortion for the same reason. It promotes, if you have a baby who's going to be a burden to the mother, it's going to harm her. Her mental state will be diminished by the birth of this child. Do you recognize these arguments? These are utilitarian arguments. The mother's pleasure will go down. Yes, the baby's pleasure will be increased, but what if the baby is poor? What if the family's really poor? Can you really be that happy if you're a poor person? These are the kinds of things that if you speak to an honest abortionist, they will tell you, and it's pretty sick. So the Nazis in Auschwitz and abortionists in Iceland, fundamentally the same problem. So you get this situation where anything that increases net happiness is required, and that includes sterilization, forced abortion, death camps. So if you start with do everything that would make the most people happy, skip a few steps, and you're killing 6 million Jews before you know it. And I did not see that coming. So this theory is capable of creating the most evil on the largest scale possible, basically just because it's all a numbers game. There's nothing higher than the most pleasure. So fortunately, people have recognized the tendency of this theory to create these horrible results, and they will modify the theory. They'll add guidelines. For no particular reason, they will pick certain guidelines. Like I was actually speaking with Brian last week, and we were talking about some theories have 6 pillars or 5 or 6 pillars of morality, and we're only going to try to maximize those for whatever reason. It's fundamentally the same problems. If you pick the wrong objectives, you're going to have the wrong conclusion. If one of your 5 pillars of morality is wrong, you're going to have wrong results. So it's not that any slight modification to this theory doesn't overcome its fundamental problems. And so we're going to basically reject this whole idea. But what we do see is it creeps into our morality in our everyday talk very often for these reasons that I spoke about. It comes in the form of this, simple obedience. So if you get good results for living a godly life, what more do you need? I know it's wrong to kill people, so I'm just not going to kill people. That's good. I get good results from that. I never go to prison for murder. What more do I need? I don't really need to know anything more about the morality, the command. It just says don't do it, so I'm just not going to do it. I get good results. I'm all set. That's kind of a simple obedience. And we saw last week, if morality is to be instructive, obedience needs to have more than simply doing a thing that was said. Also, we see that it creeps into our vocabulary because we want to avoid controversy. So this comes back to the idea that utilitarianism has the same common starting point for everyone. Goodness is good, happiness is good, unhappiness is bad. That's common for everyone. So it makes all arguments you'll ever have with an unsafe person or a random stranger anywhere, even if they're even if they are Christians, like even you and I, if we have conversations in the hallway about morality, we will often fall back to this. We'll say, oh, this did a bad thing, therefore it must have been bad. We will have these kinds of statements. And we may come to the correct conclusion where we recognize what's good and what's bad, but we might have done it from a bad starting point, and that's not good. So lastly, is it biblical? This is kind of the most important question, obviously. No, it's not. But why not? So God does not hold our happiness as the ultimate good. You won't find that anywhere in Scripture, despite what Joel Osteen will tell you. And in fact, God tells us that doing the right thing will often lead to our suffering. So 2 Timothy 3:12 says, yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. So you do the right thing and you have bad results. God says that's part of the plan. That's part of the parcel that you accepted when you got saved. Bad things will happen to you when you do good things. So obviously it's not true. Revelation 2:10 says, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. So God recognizes that you will suffer when you are good people doing good things, but you shouldn't fear that. God has your back. But that's totally contrary to utilitarianism. And now my favorite verse, if you remember last week when we talked about moral relativism, we used Isaiah 5:20 to properly debunk it, I guess you would say. Isaiah 5:20 says, woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. So that was Isaiah 5:20 telling us that moral relativism is not biblical. The very next verse says this, woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Wisdom and prudence would be carefulness for the consequences of your actions. The very next verse, in fact, deals with utilitarianism in somewhat of an indirect way, but the principle is there. It's not, our morality should not be tied to our prudent beliefs, how we believe that our actions will play themselves out. So I think it's very interesting that Isaiah 5:20 and 21 deal with two of the most common moral theories in the whole world, and they're right next to each other in the Bible. I think that's very interesting. So in summary, it is good for a moral theory to produce good outcomes, but if your whole theory is based on chasing those outcomes, it's not a good form of morality. It has fundamental flaws that you can't get around. All right, so let's dump that one. So also be careful of that theory creeping into your mind and your philosophy. It's not always 100% wrong. There are good times to use it, but not when you're talking about fundamental moral principles. All right, so now let's cover divine command theory, which is the last of our three. What is it? This theory is often the default understanding of religious and moral people of any kind. So it results from the simple and obvious observation that God, as our authority, has given us a series of commands that he expects us to obey. That's obviously true. So the basic theory goes something like this. God is our authority in all things, which is true. God gives us commands and instructions to follow, which is also true. Therefore, obeying those commands is moral, and disobeying them is immoral, which sounds good. So basically, God, as our moral authority, has given us commandments, and it's our moral obligation to obey those commandments. Very simple. Very simple, very straightforward, and pretty robust, in fact. And basically, it sums up right here. Moses comes down from the mount with two pieces of stone and says, this, it says this, God said this, don't do this. And that's basically it. So what do we get benefits for this? We do get lots of benefits. It's objective, very objective. The moral code is independent of perspective or situation. It is exactly what it says as it is written, and it's not created by man in any way. So it's not something that anyone came up with. Moses walked down with stone tablets that God literally carved himself. No input from man. It's not based on man's theories or anything like that. It's strictly objective. Also, if the scriptures are complete, so remember, we're not just talking about Christian divine command theory. Any system of morality that requires a god, like say ancient Egyptian Ra or whoever it was, whoever their top god was, he makes a command, you still have to do it based on this theory, divine command theory. He's just another version of divine. So Muslims, Jews, Christians, Hindus, I guess, everyone who has a god, this would apply to them. So if the scriptures are complete, like in Christianity, our scriptures are complete, we have a complete and fixed, unchangeable moral framework that we can work with. So that's a good thing. That's a benefit. There's a definitive, knowable moral code. Also, it's extremely clear and definitive, so the laws are laid out for us. We simply do what they say. Now, mostly for Christianity, there's a deep tradition of working out what the Bible says, and that's perfectly fine, and that's expected in any form of divine command theory. Anytime a God tells you to do something, you have to understand what he's telling you to do, and so if you come to something that is unclear, you just have to work through it. But your basic moral foundation is, what does it say? We must do that, whatever that means. There's also unquestionable authority directly from God. He writes it down, you do it. Unquestionable chain of authority. You don't have to wonder, why do I care about this person's opinion or that person's feelings? Why is it making them happy a good thing? There's just simply unquestionable authority. It comes right from God. God is the ultimate being and the good person. There's clear benefits and punishments if you have a good God, theoretically. But ultimately for Christianity, it would be considered heaven or hell. If you do good things, you go to heaven. No, that's not how it works, but if you do bad things, you go to hell. This is the general framework. If you do good things in most religions, you get good results. If you do bad things in most religions, you get bad results. And that's built into the theory, and that's a benefit for it. There's also moral neutrality. So this is important. This might seem a little like, why is this a benefit? But it is a benefit. If God has not given you a specific command on a subject, you have freedom to choose. So I picked a tie this morning. It's bluish. Blue and whatever. I had freedom to choose that. I didn't flip to Isaiah 7 and say, okay, what tie does God want me to wear today? Maybe your God will set out general frameworks, general moral principles for us to follow, like be modest, that kind of stuff. But outside of that, you have freedom to choose in certain things. So if, what car do you buy? You have freedom to choose. This is a benefit of this moral system. You don't want everything you do to be dictated specifically by a God, because you'd be very busy listening to God all the time. Okay, but let's look at some problems for this theory. And there are some big ones. So first one, multiple gods. So if you are in ancient Egypt, or I guess Hinduism, if you have multiple gods and two gods tell you to do two different things, what do? You don't know. And so this isn't a problem for us, obviously. We have one God. Most living religions today have one God. But in the ancient, say, Greece or Egypt or Rome, this was a real problem for them. What if, and they had hierarchies of gods. Well, if Zeus tells you one thing, but whoever the other one was, Apollos tells you another one, you have to rank who is telling me what. Which God do I follow? I'll ignore this God and follow that God. It's a very complicated, silly system. It's also not at all persuasive. So if someone does not believe in God, why are they going to obey him? If you walk up if you walk up to someone on the street corner and say, "Yea, hath God said?" He's going to say, "No," and that's going to be it. He doesn't believe in God, so why would he follow anything that God says? So it's not very persuasive. It requires something else to enforce its morality. So it's a flaw in the system, if you will. And this is very much unlike utilitarianism, where we looked at everyone has a common starting point. This has very different starting points. You can't convince someone to obey a God that they either hate or don't believe in. This divine command theory requires revelation and interpretation. Again, not a problem for us, but it is a problem for pagan religions that are constantly hearing from their God. So you need a constant source of revelation, and prophets therefore become very important people. You listen to them at all times. These are kind of issues. The last problem is Euthyphro's dilemma. Don't worry, we'll get to that next. So I'm just going to skip that. So how does this creep into our morality? It comes in the form of a lack of nuance and understanding. So if all you have to do is look at the command and say, "Oh, I'm just going to do that," then you lose that instruction per se. It's not so clear for now, but we'll talk about later in the next section. So last question, is it biblical? Yeah, by definition it is. I mean, it says so right there. It's right there written in the Bible. Do these things. God commands you to do things. He expects you to do it. Yeah, it's biblical. It comes right from the Bible. God does give us moral commands, and he does require us to obey them. So it seems good. Maybe we found one. Maybe we found a theory. So I have this in a handout for you. Don't pass it out just yet, Reggie, but very soon. So do we obey God's commands in the Bible because he told us to? So I want you to think about this over the next week. Yes, no, or maybe you just like the letter C and you don't want to answer. So let's look at this last objective, Euthyphro's dilemma. So since we found a form of morality that sounds like it's biblical, let's look into it. First, let's deal with this last objection. So this is Euthyphro's dilemma. And a dilemma is a situation where you are presented with two inescapable conclusions, and both of them are bad. It comes from the idea of there's two horns on a bull. You're going to take one or the other. You can't escape the bull. That's the idea. So we have this problem with divine command theory, and let's develop it. So first of all, what's Euthyphro? Euthyphro was a character from Socrates' writings way back in 400 BC. Socrates, we don't know if he's a real person or not, but Socrates had this conversation, whether real or made up, where he asked this guy named Euthyphro, he asked him this question. Is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is being loved by the gods? So this sounds very similar, but originally this was an objection to multi-theism, where if two gods are saying different things, what do we do? But this has been adapted very well to modern monotheism and can be more easily restated as this. Does God command a thing because it is good, or are the things God's command good because he commands them? So does God's command make something good, or is something good and then God commands it? These are two situations that you can't really, you have to come to one of these conclusions from divine command theory. So let's work through each one on either side. So God said it because it's good. God makes a command that recognizes a good thing and instructs us on how to perform it. This sounds pretty good. This means that there is something higher and pre-existing to God. God is seeing a moral system and describing it to us. But where did that moral system come from? There's something beyond God in that case. That's not good. This means that God is not the ultimate authority, but he is in contact with that authority. So he's kind of a middleman. There is a higher God that he's referring to, or there is some fixed set of morality that existed before him, or with him maybe. So God becomes somewhat of a middleman, and if you could theoretically just skip God and go right to that source of morality, you could. And so that would mean that there's something beyond God, which obviously for us as Christians is a bad thing. That's impossible. So let's look at the other option. God made a command which makes it good. So this is a little bit different. The mere act of God making that command makes the thing good. This justifies anything and everything, as long as it was God who commanded it. Now, doesn't seem like so much of a problem for us right now, but let's go to the conclusion. So this leads to contradictions, which is not a problem for Christians or monotheists in general, since they believe that a perfect God cannot contradict himself. That's fine. But more importantly for us, this makes goodness itself arbitrary and therefore not informative. It can't teach you anything if God is simply making a command and he expects you to obey it. So let's, Reggie, can you pass out that handout now? And let's look at this. Let's kind of graph it a little bit better. So Euthyphro's dilemma, you're going to get this in a handout. God makes a command. So either God made the command because it's good, which means God is not the source of that goodness. He simply recognizes it and passes it along to us. So God is not the ultimate authority. He's just a middleman. Therefore, something is higher than God. This is the first horn, and this is a bad thing. This will defeat this whole moral theory just by itself. Okay, so let's avoid that one. Let's go to the other side. The command is good because God made it. Goodness, therefore, is created by the command of God. Goodness is arbitrary, and morality is merely obedience, which is bad because we know the Bible says morality must be instructive. And this horn, you don't learn anything from your morality. They're simply commands that you have to obey. So this is a very ancient objection to divine command theory. Divine command theory being what most people just believe by default. And this is a problem. When I took a class at UMass Lowell on ethics. It was a secular class. The guy teaching it had, he was, I don't know what his religious beliefs were. He was probably atheist or agnostic of some kind. But he presented this problem to me. And I had to really struggle with this because I just, I was like 20. Up until that point, I had just default, oh yeah, the Bible says a thing, which makes it good. And then he presented this to me, and I'm like, oh, that's a really tough question. How do I deal with that as a Christian? How do I puzzle out this issue of God's commands are not to be obeyed simply because he makes the command? How do I do this? And so I'm going to leave you with that. So you're all going to have the same struggle that I did. And next week we'll talk about it, and there is a solution, but I want you all to think about it. So take that handout, stick it up on your refrigerator, think about it all next week, and I want you to really decide, do we obey God's commands because he told us to? And I think you will find the answer very helpful and instructive. So next week we'll talk about that. And that's it. You're dismissed.